The crimson sunset painted Council Bluffs, Iowa, with gold as Ethan Irwin hammered the last post of his new fence into place, each strike echoing the vow he'd made 5 years earlier when his wife Sarah and infant son died during a harsh winter. Never again would he let anyone close enough to destroy him when they were taken away. The 28-year-old rancher stepped back to examine his work, not just the physical barrier surrounding his modest homestead, but the invisible one he'd constructed around his heart. That should keep everything that matters in and everything that doesn't out, Ethan muttered to himself, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool April breeze of 1872. His ranch sat on the outskirts of Council Bluffs, close enough to civilization for a necessary trade, but far enough to avoid unwanted company. Just how he preferred it. Ethan's dog, Buck, a loyal shepherd mix, trotted to his side as he gathered his tools. The setting sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of his 50 acres. He'd worked hard for this land, building it up from nothing after moving west from Pennsylvania following the war, first as a cattle hand, then foreman, until finally purchasing this plot with savings and determination. As he trudged back toward his cabin, Ethan spotted a lone rider approaching from the east. He squinted against the fading light, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. Strangers rarely brought good news. The figure drew closer, and Ethan realized with surprise it was Roger Milner, the town's telegraph operator. The slight man looked uncomfortable on horseback, bouncing awkwardly with each step of the borrowed mare. "Evening, Irwin," Roger called, bringing the horse to an unsteady halt. "Got a telegram for you. Said it was urgent, so I figured I'd bring it out myself rather than wait for you to come to town." Ethan frowned, taking the folded paper. "Obliged," he said simply, though his mind raced through possibilities. Few people knew where he was. Fewer still would contact him. Roger lingered awkwardly. "Don't suppose you'd offer a man a drink after that ride? My backside's going to feel this tomorrow." "Water pumps around back," Ethan replied flatly. "Help yourself before heading back." The disappointment on Roger's face was clear, but Ethan had long since stopped concerning himself with others' expectations. After Roger departed, Ethan unfolded the telegram beneath the lantern light on his porch. "Uncle Ethan, stop. Father passed last month. Stop mother, followed last week. Stop arriving, gets council. Bluffs May 3rd. Stop your niece. Nora, stop." Ethan read the telegram 3 times, his heart pounding. His brother James dead. James's wife too. And their daughter Nora, whom he'd never met, was coming here. The fence he'd just completed suddenly seemed inadequate. "Damn it all," he whispered, crumpling the paper in his fist. Buck whined at his feet, sensing his distress. The following week passed in a blur of preparation and dread. Ethan cleared out the small storage room, converting it into a bedroom with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers he'd made years ago for his son but never used, and a small mirror. He didn't know how old the girl was. James had written about her birth some 18 or 19 years ago, but they'd fallen out of correspondence during the war. Ethan had sent a letter after Sarah died, but received no response. On the morning of May 3rd, Ethan rode into Council Bluffs with his stomach in knots. The small but growing town bustled with activity as the regular stagecoach from the east was due. He tied his horse outside the general store and nodded curtly to the owner, Harold Fleming. "Morning, Irwin," Fleming called cheerfully. "Rare sight seeing you in town twice in 1 month." "Expecting someone," Ethan replied, not elaborating further. "Well, coach is due any minute. Coffee while you wait?" Ethan declined and stood stiffly on the boardwalk, watching the road. When the stagecoach finally appeared in a cloud of dust, he felt his pulse quicken. 4 passengers disembarked an elderly couple, a businessman in an expensive suit, and finally a young woman in a dusty blue traveling dress, clutching a small valise and looking around uncertainly. Ethan recognized her immediately. She had James's eyes and her mother's delicate features, though there was a determined set to her jaw that reminded him of his own mother. She spotted him just as clearly, perhaps from family resemblance, and walked directly to him. "Uncle Ethan?" she asked, her voice steady despite her obvious fatigue. "Miss Nora," he replied with a nod. "I'm sorry about your parents." "Thank you," she said simply. "And thank you for taking me in. I know it's unexpected." Unexpected was an understatement. Ethan took her small valise, noticing the worn leather and careful mending. "Is this all you have?" "My trunk should be arriving on the freight wagon tomorrow. I shipped it ahead." She glanced around the town. "So this is Council Bluffs. It's smaller than I imagined." "Growing every year," Ethan said, leading her to his horse. "We'll have to ride double back to the ranch. It's about 5 miles. Nora Newell nodded, seemingly unfazed by the prospect. She allowed him to help her onto the horse before mounting behind her. The ride back was mostly silent, save for a few polite observations about the landscape. Ethan was acutely aware of her presence, a disruption to the solitary life he'd carefully constructed. As they crested the final hill, his ranch came into view, the modest cabin, the new barn he'd finished last fall, the corral with 3 horses, and, of course, the fence stretching around the perimeter of his immediate property. "That's quite a fence," Nora remarked. "Wolves a problem out here?" "Something like that," Ethan replied. Upon reaching the cabin, Buck came bounding out to greet them, barking excitedly at the newcomer. "Down, Buck!" Ethan commanded, dismounting and offering a hand to help Nora down. The dog circled Nora curiously, tail wagging. "Hello there," she said softly, extending her hand for Buck to sniff. The dog licked her fingers and pressed his head against her palm. Ethan frowned. Buck wasn't usually so quick to warm up to strangers. "He likes you," Ethan observed. "Animals usually do," Nora replied with a small smile, the first he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, bringing a warmth to her features that made her look even more like his brother. Ethan showed her to the room he'd prepared, explaining the basics of the ranch's routine and where to find what she needed. "Washrooms out back, pumps on the porch. I rise at dawn, turn in after dark." Nora nodded, taking it all in with calm appraisal. "And what will my duties be?" The question caught him off guard. "Duties? Yes, Uncle. I don't expect to stay here for free. I can cook, clean, mend, garden. I helped run our household in Philadelphia after Mother took ill." Ethan hadn't considered this aspect. He'd been so focused on the disruption to his life that he hadn't thought about practicalities. "We can discuss that tomorrow. You should rest now. Supper in an hour." That evening, they ate a simple meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread in silence. Ethan watched surreptitiously as Nora ate with careful manners but healthy appetite, clearly hungry after her journey. When she offered to wash the dishes, he didn't refuse. Later, as she retired to her room, Ethan sat on the porch, smoking his pipe and contemplating the sudden change to his carefully ordered existence. Buck lay at his feet, occasionally glancing toward the door, as if checking on their guest. "Don't get attached," Ethan told the dog. "She won't be staying long." But even as he said it, he wondered what exactly "not long" meant. She had nowhere else to go, as far as he knew. She was family, his only family now. And despite his determination to keep his emotional distance, something about her quiet strength reminded him painfully of Sarah. He tapped his pipe against the porch rail, watching the embers scatter in the darkness. The fence stood stark against the moonlit landscape, a physical manifestation of his resolve, but he couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, he'd left a gate unlatched. The following days established a cautious routine. Ethan rose before dawn as usual, but now found coffee already brewing and Nora busy preparing breakfast. She worked efficiently and without complaint, taking on household tasks that had long been neglected. By the end of her first week, the cabin was cleaner than it had been in years. Curtains hung in windows that had previously been bare, and meals had become remarkably more palatable. Ethan maintained his distance, spending long days working the ranch, checking fence lines, tending to the small herd of cattle he kept in the north pasture, and breaking a new colt he'd purchased in the winter. He returned each evening to find the cabin transformed bit by bit, becoming something he hardly recognized a home rather than merely shelter. "Your trunk arrived," Ethan announced one evening, hauling the heavy wooden box into the cabin. Fleming brought it out with his supply wagon. "Thank you," Nora said, looking up from the shirt she was mending one of his, which had been sitting in a pile of repairs he never got around to. "Did Mr. Fleming mention the seeds I ordered?" "Seeds?" Ethan frowned. "Yes, for the garden. I noticed the plot behind the house hasn't been tended in some time, but the soil looks good. I thought we might grow some vegetables, save you trips to town." "We don't need a garden," Ethan said flatly. The last person who tried that was... He stopped abruptly. Your wife, Nora finished quietly. Ethan stiffened. He hadn't mentioned Sarah or the baby to her. My father told me, she explained, setting aside her mending. Before the war, he said you'd married a local girl and were expecting. I'm sorry for your loss, Uncle. Ethan turned away, unable to respond. The easy way she acknowledged what everyone else in his life had learned to never mention left him speechless. He busied himself with stoking the fire, not trusting his voice. The seeds will arrive next week, Nora continued after a moment, returning to her mending. I used my own money. You needn't worry about the expense. That night, Ethan lay awake longer than usual, memories he'd long suppressed rising unbidden. Sarah laughing as she planted her garden, her belly just beginning to show with their child. Her joy when the first shoots appeared, her face pale and still, after the fever took her, their son already gone. The next morning, Ethan left before breakfast, returning mid-afternoon with a wagon full of lumber. Without explanation, he began constructing raised beds in the garden plot behind the house. Nora watched from the window, but said nothing, giving him space to work through whatever drove him. By evening, he had completed 3 large beds, the wood fresh and bright against the dark soil. When he finally came inside, sweaty and tired, Nora had dinner waiting. Thank you, she said simply as they ate. Ethan nodded, not meeting her eyes. Raised beds are better, less bending, better drainage. It was the most he'd said at one time since her arrival. I've never used them before, Nora admitted. Perhaps you could show me how to prepare them properly. And so, the next day, Ethan found himself working alongside his niece, explaining the layers of soil, compost, and drainage material needed for successful raised beds. Nora listened attentively, asking intelligent questions and working without complaint despite the spring sun beating down on them. You're not what I expected, Ethan found himself saying as they finished the last bed. Nora brushed soil from her hands. What did you expect? He considered the question. Someone softer, city-bred, complaining about the work or the isolation. A smile touched her lips. I may have lived in Philadelphia, Uncle, but my life wasn't easy. Father's business failed after the war. Mother was ill for years. I've been managing a household since I was 14. James never wrote about troubles, Ethan said, surprised. He was proud, too proud to ask for help. Nora's voice held no bitterness, only a matter-of-fact acceptance that made Ethan wonder if the stubborn pride ran in more than one branch of the family tree. As spring progressed into early summer, the ranch slowly transformed. The garden flourished under Nora's care, with Ethan occasionally offering advice based on what Sarah had learned through trial and error. The cabin interior became more comfortable, with small touches appearing wildflowers in a jar on the table, a quilt Nora unpacked from her trunk, draped over the shabby sofa, the scent of fresh bread replacing the stale emptiness that had pervaded the place for years. More surprising to Ethan was his gradual adjustment to her presence. He found himself returning to the cabin earlier in the evenings, sometimes even initiating conversation over dinner. He learned that Nora had been educated at a girls' school before her family's financial troubles forced her to leave, that she loved reading and had brought a small collection of books in her trunk, that she could play the piano but hadn't touched one since her mother sold theirs 3 years ago. In turn, he found himself sharing small pieces of his own history stories, of his time as a cavalry scout during the war, how he'd come west afterward, unable to face returning to Pennsylvania, his early days working cattle drives before saving enough to buy his own land. One evening in late June, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the tall grass beyond the fence, Nora asked the question he'd been dreading. Why did you build that fence, Uncle? It seems excessive for the property. Ethan took a long time to answer, puffing on his pipe and watching the smoke drift away in the twilight. Finally, he said, after Sarah and the baby died, I decided some things weren't meant to last. Better to keep everything that might matter outside the fence. Including people? Nora asked softly. Especially people. Nora considered this, her expression thoughtful in the fading light. Yet, you took me in. Your family, he said, as if that explained everything, though they both knew it didn't. Plenty of families were estranged, including his and James's for many years. The fence has a gate, she observed, nodding toward the main entrance to the property. Every fence needs a gate, Ethan replied, for practical purposes. But gates can be opened from either side, Nora said, a small smile playing at her lips. Something to consider. Before he could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats caught their attention. Visitors at this hour were rare. Ethan reached instinctively for the rifle he kept beside the door, a habit from years living alone on the frontier. The rider approached the gate, and in the dim light, Ethan recognized Thomas Harding, the town's young doctor. The man reined his horse to a stop and called out a greeting. "Evening, Irwin. Sorry to disturb you so late." Ethan set the rifle down and walked to meet him. "What brings you out here, Doc?" "Mrs. Peterson's time has come, and it's looking to be a difficult birth. I'm heading out to their place now, but I could use an assistant. Fleming mentioned your niece has nursing experience." Harding's gaze shifted to Nora, who had followed Ethan to the gate. Ethan turned to her, surprised. "You didn't mention that." "You didn't ask," Nora replied simply. "I helped our doctor with several births in our neighborhood." She addressed Harding directly. "I'd be happy to assist, Doctor." "It's 5 miles to the Peterson place," Ethan said, frowning. "It's dark already." "Which is why I brought a spare horse," Harding replied, gesturing to the second mount tethered behind his. "Mrs. Peterson's in a bad way, Irwin. Her husband rode for me 2 hours ago." Ethan looked at Nora, who was already heading back to the cabin, presumably to gather whatever she needed. The thought of her riding off into the night with the young doctor, a bachelor known to be popular with the town's single women, didn't sit well with him, though he couldn't articulate why. "I'll ride with you," he found himself saying. Harding looked relieved. "Much obliged. I was hoping you'd offer. 3 pairs of hands are better than 2. Minutes later, they were riding hard toward the Peterson homestead, Nora on the doctor's spare mount, her skirts arranged as modestly as possible for riding astride. She kept pace easily, impressing Ethan with her horsemanship. The night was long and harrowing. Anna Peterson, barely 20 and delivering her first child, struggled through a difficult labor. Harding worked tirelessly, with Nora assisting capably, her manner calm and reassuring despite the tense circumstances. Ethan found himself relegated to keeping Anna's frantic husband, Daniel, occupied outside the bedroom, making coffee and fetching water and clean linens when needed. Near dawn, the thin cry of a newborn finally pierced the exhausted silence of the cabin. Daniel leapt to his feet, but Ethan put a restraining hand on his arm. "Give them a minute, son," he advised, the endearment slipping out unplanned. Daniel was only a few years younger than himself, but seemed like a boy in his nervous excitement. When Harding finally emerged, tired but smiling, Daniel rushed past him into the bedroom. The doctor collapsed into a chair opposite Ethan. "Mother and daughter both doing well, thanks largely to your niece," Harding said, accepting the coffee Ethan offered. "She's got a steady hand and doesn't flinch under pressure." "Not qualities you find often." Ethan nodded, a strange pride warming his chest. "She's an Irwin," he said, though technically she was a Newell. The distinction suddenly seemed unimportant. When Nora finally emerged, her sleeves rolled up and apron spotted with blood, but her face glowing with satisfaction, Ethan saw her in a new light. This wasn't just his brother's daughter taking refuge in his home. This was a capable, compassionate woman who had just helped bring new life into the world. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, all three too exhausted for conversation. The sun was well up by the time they returned, and Ethan insisted Harding stay for breakfast before the ride back to town. As they ate the hastily prepared meal, Harding addressed Nora. "Miss Newell, your assistance was invaluable. I wonder if you might consider helping me again in similar situations. Council Bluffs has no trained midwife, and I often find myself in need of competent assistance." Nora glanced at Ethan before responding. "I would need my uncle's permission, as I have responsibilities here." Ethan met her gaze, surprised by her deference. She had never asked his permission for anything before. "The ranch work wouldn't suffer if you helped the doc occasionally," he said carefully. "It's good work you'd be doing." The smile she gave him was worth the prospect of occasional disruption to their routine. And when Harding left with a promise to call on Nora the following Sunday to discuss medical matters, Ethan found himself watching the young doctor ride away with an unexpected twinge of something that felt suspiciously like jealousy. That night, too wound up to sleep despite his exhaustion, Ethan sat on the porch long after Nora had retired. The fence stood as it always had, a dark line against the night sky, but for the first time since building it, he wondered if it served any real purpose beyond reminding him of what he was trying to keep out, or perhaps what he was trying to keep in. Summer progressed with a new rhythm to their days. Nora continued her transformation of the cabin and garden, while also riding into town once or twice a week to assist Dr. Harding. Ethan found himself becoming accustomed to her absences, though the cabin seemed emptier when she was gone, the silence heavier than it had been before her arrival. The garden flourished, yielding more vegetables than the two of them could eat. Nora began preserving the excess, filling the root cellar with jars of pickled beans, beets, and relishes. She also started taking eggs and butter into town to trade for items they needed, establishing a small but steady income of her own that she insisted on contributing to the household. As promised, Dr. Harding called regularly, initially under the pretext of discussing patients, but increasingly for social visits. Ethan observed their growing friendship with mixed feelings. Thomas Harding was a good man, educated, respectful, with a promising future in the growing town. By all measures, he would make an excellent match for Nora. Yet, the thought of her marrying and moving away left Ethan with an emptiness he wasn't prepared to examine too closely. One sweltering July afternoon, Ethan returned from checking cattle in the north pasture to find an unfamiliar horse tethered outside the cabin. For a moment, he assumed it was Harding's, but this was a fine chestnut mare he didn't recognize. He dismounted cautiously, his hand dropping instinctively to his holster. The sound of laughter Nora's drifted from inside, alongside a male voice that wasn't the doctor's. Ethan entered to find Nora serving coffee to a well-dressed man, perhaps a few years older than himself. Both looked up as he entered. "Uncle Ethan," Nora greeted him warmly. "This is Mr. Edward Blackburn from Omaha. Mr. Blackburn, my uncle, Ethan Irwin." The man rose, extending his hand. "Mr. Irwin, a pleasure. Your niece has been most hospitable." Ethan shook his hand. Noting the man's fine clothes and soft hands that had clearly never seen a day of ranch work. "What brings you to Council Bluffs, Mr. Blackburn?" "Business primarily. I represent the Midland Railroad. We're surveying for a new spur line and purchasing land rights." Blackburn smiled, revealing perfect teeth. "But I must admit, the opportunity to meet the town's new medical assistant was an added incentive for today's ride. Dr. Harding speaks very highly of Miss Newell's skills." Ethan glanced at Nora, who was pouring coffee with a composed expression that revealed nothing of her thoughts. "You know Thomas?" he asked Blackburn. "We were at school together in Chicago," Blackburn confirmed. "When I mentioned I was coming to Council Bluffs, he insisted I must meet his capable assistant." His gaze lingered appreciatively on Nora. He didn't mention she was also charming and beautiful. A protective instinct rose in Ethan's chest. "My niece is indeed capable," he said stiffly, "and busy. We have a ranch to run." If Blackburn noticed the coolness in Ethan's tone, he gave no indication. "Of course, I won't impose on your hospitality much longer. I merely wanted to extend an invitation to both of you for the town social next Saturday. The railroad is sponsoring it as a gesture of goodwill to the community." "That's very kind," Nora replied before Ethan could refuse. "We don't get to many social events, do we, Uncle?" "None, if I can help it," Ethan muttered, but not quietly enough. Blackburn laughed as if he'd made a joke. "All the more reason to attend. It promises to be quite an event. We've hired musicians from Omaha, and there will be a proper dinner served at the new hotel." After Blackburn finally departed, leaving behind the formal invitation and lingering scent of expensive cologne, Ethan turned to Nora with a frown. "You shouldn't encourage men like that to call on you," he said, more sharply than intended. Nora raised an eyebrow. "Men like what, exactly? Educated? Well-mannered? Dr. Harding sent him, Uncle. I could hardly turn away a friend of Thomas's." "Thomas, is it?" Ethan scoffed. "You're becoming quite familiar with the town's eligible bachelors." A flash of hurt crossed Nora's face, quickly replaced by annoyance. "Would you prefer I spend all my time here behind your fence, Uncle? Is that why you took me in to keep your house and garden while avoiding all human contact beyond the property line?" The accusation stung precisely because there was a grain of truth in it. When he'd first received her telegram, Hadn't he viewed her primarily as an obligation and potential disruption? But things had changed over the past months. He valued her presence for more than the practical help she provided. He'd come to enjoy their conversations, her quick mind, the way she challenged him to think beyond his self-imposed isolation. "That's not fair," he said finally. "I've supported your work with Harding, haven't I?" "Yes," she conceded, her expression softening. "And I appreciate that. But there's more to life than work, Uncle. Even you must remember that." Before he could respond, she changed the subject. "Will you escort me to the social on Saturday? I'd like to go, but I understand if you prefer not to." Ethan sighed, knowing he was defeated. The thought of Nora attending alone or worse, on Blackburn's arm, was even less appealing than an evening of forced sociability. "I'll take you," he agreed reluctantly. "But don't expect me to enjoy it." The corner of her mouth lifted in a small smile. "I would never impose such an unreasonable expectation, Uncle." The days leading up to the social were filled with subtle tension. Ethan threw himself into ranch work, often returning after dark to find dinner waiting, but Nora already retired. He told himself it was better this way, maintaining some distance after their disagreement, but the truth was he missed their evening conversations on the porch. On Saturday afternoon, he returned from town with a package that he awkwardly handed to Nora. "Fleming's wife suggested this," he explained gruffly. "For tonight, if you don't have something suitable already." Nora opened the package to find a length of blue silk ribbon. "It's beautiful," she said, genuine surprise and pleasure in her voice. "Thank you, Uncle." "It's nothing," he muttered, embarrassed by her gratitude for such a small gesture. "Mrs. Fleming said it would match your eyes." The smile she gave him made something twist inside his chest. "I'll wear it tonight." That evening, as Ethan waited on the porch dressed in his one good suit last, worn to Sarah's funeral, he felt as nervous as a young man awaiting his first dance. When Nora finally emerged from the cabin, he momentarily forgot to breathe. She wore a simple dress of deep blue, not new but well made, and carefully altered to fit her slim figure. Her dark hair was arranged in a style more elaborate than her usual practical bun, with the blue ribbon woven through it. She wasn't flashy like some of the town girls with their bright colors and excessive ornaments, but there was an elegance to her simplicity that made those others seem garish by comparison. "Will I do, Uncle?" she asked, misinterpreting his silence for disapproval. Ethan cleared his throat. "You look very nice," he managed, the words woefully inadequate. "We should go, if we're to be on time." The ride to town was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the hotel where the social was being held, Ethan became acutely aware of how long it had been since he'd participated in any community event. The last time had been with Sarah, at a barn raising before her pregnancy became difficult. The hotel's main room had been transformed for the occasion, with tables around the perimeter and the center cleared for dancing. Lanterns and paper decorations hung from the ceiling, and a small group of musicians was setting up in the corner. Already, most of the town seemed to be present, the room buzzing with conversation and laughter. Dr. Harding spotted them immediately and made his way through the crowd. "Miss Newell, Mr. Irwin, I'm delighted you came." He looked genuinely pleased to see them both. "You look absolutely lovely, Miss Newell." "Thank you, Doctor," Nora replied with a smile. "And thank you for sending Mr. Blackburn our way with the invitation." "Ah, yes, Edward always did have a knack for making a favorable impression. Especially on beautiful women," Harding added, with a slight edge to his voice. "Speaking of whom, I believe he's looking for you. Something about the first dance being promised to the railroad?" As if on cue, Blackburn appeared, resplendent in an expensive suit that made Ethan's best look shabby by comparison. "Miss Newell, you've outshone every flower in Iowa tonight," he declared, taking her hand and bringing it gallantly to his lips. "May I claim the first dance? The musicians are about to begin." Before Nora could respond, Mrs. Fleming descended upon their group, insisting on introducing Nora to absolutely everyone, and pulling her away toward a cluster of the town's matrons. Blackburn looked momentarily thwarted, but quickly recovered. "Another time, then," he called after her, before turning to Ethan and Harding. "Gentlemen, I trust you're enjoying the evening thus far. The railroad has spared no expense to impress Council Bluffs." "Very generous," Harding replied, his usual friendly demeanor slightly strained. "Though I understand it's not entirely altruistic. Land purchase negotiations tend to go more smoothly after free whiskey and music. Blackburn laughed. You know me too well, Thomas. Business and pleasure need not be mutually exclusive. His gaze drifted to where Nora stood across the room. Speaking of pleasure, your medical assistant is even more charming than you suggested. You've been holding out on me. Miss Newell is a respected medical professional, Harding said stiffly. And Mr. Irwin's niece, he added, with a significant glance at Ethan. Of course, Blackburn said smoothly. I meant no disrespect. If you'll excuse me, gentlemen, I have other guests to greet. As Blackburn moved away, Harding turned to Ethan with an apologetic expression. I'm sorry about that. Edward has always been forward with ladies who catch his interest. I perhaps should have anticipated his reaction to Miss Newell. Ethan studied the young doctor, noting the genuine concern in his expression. You care for my niece, he stated rather than asked. Harding's face flushed slightly. Miss Newell is an exceptional woman, Mr. Irwin. Intelligent, compassionate, skilled. Any man would be fortunate to earn her regard. He hesitated before adding, I had hoped, with time, she might consider me more than just a colleague. The simple honesty of the confession caught Ethan off guard. He'd suspected Harding's interest, but hadn't expected such a direct acknowledgement. Before he could respond, the music began, and across the room he saw Blackburn leading Nora onto the dance floor. The railroad man moved with practiced grace, guiding Nora through the steps of the waltz with a familiarity that suggested many such evenings in fine ballrooms. Nora followed competently, if with less polish, a slight flush on her cheeks that could have been from exertion or pleasure or both. She dances well, Harding observed, following Ethan's gaze. Her mother insisted on lessons, even after they fell on hard times, Ethan found himself saying, remembering a rare letter from James where he'd complained about the expense but admitted pride in his daughter's accomplishments. As the evening progressed, Ethan maintained his position at the periphery of the gathering, declining invitations to dance from several of the town's widows and married women. He watched as Nora danced not only with Blackburn again, but also with Harding, young Daniel Peterson, his wife staying home with their new baby, and several other men from town. She seemed to be enjoying herself, her face animated as she conversed with her various partners and the town women who increasingly sought her company between dances. Ethan was so focused on observing Nora that he failed to notice Mrs. Fleming approaching until she spoke directly beside him. Your niece is making quite an impression, Mr. Irwin, the storekeeper's wife said, following his gaze to where Nora was laughing at something Harding had said. We're all so pleased to finally meet her, though I must say, we'd begun to wonder if you were keeping her prisoner out at that ranch of yours. The comment, though delivered with a teasing smile, struck uncomfortably close to Nora's own accusation. She's free to come and go as she pleases, Ethan replied stiffly. Mrs. Fleming patted his arm. Of course she is, dear. I'm only saying it's nice to see her enjoying some company her own age. A beautiful young woman shouldn't spend all her time cooped up with her uncle, no matter how devoted he might be. Before Ethan could formulate a response to this, Blackburn appeared at Nora's side again, whispering something in her ear that made her eyes widen slightly before she nodded. The railroad man then led her not back to the dance floor, but toward the hotel's front doors, which opened onto a veranda. A prickle of unease ran through Ethan. Excuse me, he said to Mrs. Fleming, already moving in their direction. He was intercepted by Fleming himself, wanting to discuss a potential cattle sale, and by the time he extricated himself, Nora and Blackburn had disappeared through the doors. Ethan followed, emerging onto the veranda to find it empty, except for a few older gentlemen smoking cigars at the far end. With growing concern, he descended the steps and rounded the corner of the building where a small garden had been planted alongside the hotel. There, in the shadow of a large oak tree, he spotted two figures standing close together. As he approached, he heard Nora's voice, firm despite its softness. That's very flattering, Mr. Blackburn, but I'm afraid I must decline. Miss Newell, Nora, please consider carefully, Blackburn was saying, his hand resting on her arm in a way that appeared casual but prevented her easy withdrawal. Opportunities like this don't come along often for a woman in your position. Omaha is a growing city with real culture. As my wife, you would want for nothing. Your wife? Nora repeated, sounding genuinely surprised. "Mr. Blackburn, we've known each other less than a week." "Some things don't require lengthy acquaintance," Blackburn replied smoothly. "I knew the moment I saw you that you were meant for more than this provincial town and its simple people. You have refinement, intelligence. Why waste it here when you could grace my home in Omaha?" Ethan had heard enough. He stepped forward, deliberately making his footfalls heavy on the garden path. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Blackburn released Nora's arm immediately, his charming smile sliding back into place. "Mr. Irwin, your niece and I were just discussing her future prospects." "Were you now?" Ethan moved to Nora's side, noting her relieved expression. "And what did you conclude?" "Actually, Uncle, I was just explaining to Mr. Blackburn that my future lies here in Council Bluffs," Nora said firmly, "with my medical work and our ranch." Blackburn's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I fear Miss Newell may be making a hasty decision based on limited experience. The opportunities I'm offering in Omaha—" "My niece said no," Ethan interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "In my experience, that's the end of the discussion among gentlemen." A flash of anger crossed Blackburn's face before he composed himself. "Of course. My apologies if I was overzealous, Miss Newell. The offer remains open should you reconsider." He bowed slightly before walking back toward the hotel, his posture stiff. When he was gone, Nora let out a long breath. "Thank you, Uncle." He was becoming rather insistent. "Did he harm you?" Ethan asked, barely containing his anger at the thought. "No, nothing like that," she assured him quickly. "He was just very confident that his offer was irresistible." She shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "Imagine proposing marriage to someone you've just met." "Some men see a beautiful woman and think possession is the same as love," Ethan said, offering her his arm. "Shall we return to the dance, or would you prefer to leave?" Nora took his arm, hesitating. "Actually, there's one thing I'd like before we return." She looked up at him, a hint of shyness in her expression that he'd never seen before. "Would you dance with me, Uncle? Just once?" The request caught him off guard. "I haven't danced in years," he admitted. "I'd likely embarrass us both." "I don't mind," she said softly. "Please, it would mean a great deal to me." Unable to refuse her, Ethan led her back inside, where the musicians were playing a slower, simpler tune than the earlier waltzes. Taking a deep breath, he placed one hand at her waist, took her other hand in his, and began to move in time with the music. At first, he was acutely conscious of his stiff movements, the years of disuse evident in every step. But gradually, muscle memory returned, and he found the familiar rhythm. Nora followed his lead perfectly. Her hand light in his, her eyes never leaving his face. "You dance very well for someone so out of practice," she observed with a small smile. "I used to enjoy it," he admitted. Before your fence went up," she finished for him, her voice gentle. The perceptiveness of her comment struck him deeply. "Yes," he acknowledged. "Before that." As they moved across the floor, Ethan became aware of curious glances from the townspeople. No doubt his presence on the dance floor was a subject of some amazement, especially with his niece as his partner. Yet he found to his surprise that he didn't care. For the first time in years, he was simply living in the moment, aware of the music, the movement, and the woman in his arms. When the dance ended, they stood for a moment longer than necessary, neither quite ready to break the connection. Finally, Nora stepped back, a flush on her cheeks that matched the warmth Ethan felt in his own face. "Thank you," she said simply. "My pleasure," he replied, and meant it. The rest of the evening passed in something of a blur. Ethan found himself drawn into conversations with neighbors he'd barely spoken to in years, discussing cattle prices, weather patterns, and the potential impact of the railroad. Nora danced several more times with Harding, and once with the young sheriff, but not again with Blackburn, who maintained a cool distance for the remainder of the event. It was nearly midnight when they finally departed, Nora declining Harding's offer to escort her home, with a gentle reminder that she'd arrived with her uncle. The ride back to the ranch was quiet but companionable, both tired but content with the evening's events. As they approached the gate in the fence, Ethan found himself seeing it through new eyes. What had once seemed a necessary barrier now looked like what it was, a flimsy wooden structure that kept nothing of importance out and nothing of value in. Nora must have been thinking along similar lines, for, as he helped her down from her horse, she said quietly, "You know, Uncle, fences can be taken down as easily as they're put up." Ethan met her gaze in the moonlight. "Some barriers are harder to dismantle than others." "Perhaps," she agreed, "but it helps to have the right tools." With that cryptic comment, she turned and entered the cabin, leaving Ethan to wonder exactly what tools she meant and whether he was ready to use them. The days following the social brought subtle but significant shifts in the dynamics between Ethan and Nora. Their conversations grew more personal, extending beyond the practical matters of running the ranch to memories, hopes, and occasional philosophies. Ethan found himself sharing stories of Sarah that he'd never told anyone, how she'd loved thunderstorms and would stand on the porch to watch them roll in across the plains, how she'd sung to their unborn child every night, how her laugh could make him forget every hardship they'd faced. In turn, Nora spoke of her parents, her father's stubborn pride that prevented him from seeking help, even as their circumstances deteriorated. Her mother's quiet strength as illness slowly claimed her, the small rituals of dignity they'd maintained even in poverty. Father never stopped loving Mother. Even when her illness consumed all our resources and his business failed, Nora said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching distant lightning illuminate the summer sky. He read to her every night, the same books they'd enjoyed in better times. Sometimes I'd hear him crying afterward when he thought I was asleep, but each morning he'd put on a brave face and continue on. James always was determined, Ethan said softly, even as a boy. He spoke of you often, especially after Mother took ill, Nora continued. He regretted the distance between you, both physical and emotional. She hesitated before adding, he wanted to write to you after you lost Sarah and the baby, but he didn't know what to say. By the time he found the words, years had passed, and he feared it was too late. Ethan absorbed this in silence, remembering his own inability to reach out after his loss. Pride and fear, he finally said. The Irwin family legacy. Not entirely, Nora replied with a small smile. There's also stubborn determination and unexpected kindness. Those seem to run in the family as well. July stretched into August, bringing sweltering heat that left the grass yellow and the creek bed dry. Ethan and the neighboring ranchers began to worry about their cattle as water sources dwindled and grazing became scarce. The garden required daily watering, which Nora managed by cleverly diverting washing water to the plants, wasting nothing. Dr. Harding continued his regular visits, always professional, but with an underlying affection that was increasingly obvious to Ethan. The young doctor clearly adored Nora, and while she treated him with genuine warmth, Ethan couldn't help noticing that she maintained a certain reserve. Was it out of respect for her position as his assistant, or was there another reason she kept Harding at a friendly distance? Edward Blackburn had returned to Omaha after the social, but sent a letter to Nora the following week, reiterating his offer of marriage in flowery terms that made Ethan's jaw clench when she read portions aloud, more amused than flattered. She penned a polite but firm rejection and asked Ethan to post it on his next trip to town. "You're certain?" he asked, the letter heavy in his hand. "He's offering financial security, a life in the city." "I'm certain," Nora replied without hesitation. "Mr. Blackburn doesn't want a wife. He wants an ornament to display at dinner parties. Besides," she added with a soft smile, "I've grown rather fond of the prairie, the space, the sky. Even the fence has its charm." The reference to the fence brought a rush of complex emotions. Ethan had been contemplating it more frequently since the night of the dance, what it represented, whether it still served any purpose beyond habit. He'd even found himself standing at the gate one morning, hand on the latch, wondering what would happen if he simply left it open. In mid-August, the drought finally broke with a violent thunderstorm that swept across the prairie with little warning. Ethan and Nora had just finished dinner when the first rumble of thunder shook the cabin. They moved to the porch to watch, as had become their custom with summer storms, but this one approached with unusual speed and ferocity. "This looks worse than usual," Ethan observed as lightning split the sky, closer than he'd expected. "We should check the barn, make sure everything's secure." They hurried across the yard just as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. By the time they reached the barn, the sky had opened completely, drenching them in seconds. Inside, the horses were nervous, sensing the approaching storm. Ethan and Nora worked quickly to calm them, checking that windows were latched and the roof seemed sound. "I should get back to the house," Nora shouted over a particularly loud crash of thunder. "There's laundry on the line." "It's too late for that," Ethan replied, glancing out the small window where rain was now falling in sheets. "Best wait it out here." As if to emphasize his point, a blinding flash of lightning was followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. One of the horses reared in panic, nearly breaking its tether, and Ethan moved quickly to calm it. When he turned back, he found Nora standing frozen, her face pale. "Are you all right?" he asked, concerned. She nodded, but another lightning strike had her flinching visibly. "I don't usually mind storms, but this one—" Ethan realized with surprise that she was frightened, something he'd never seen from her before, even during the difficult birth at the Petersons, or when confronting Blackburn's unwanted advances. "Come sit," he said, gesturing to a bench along the wall where he sometimes repaired tack. "It's just noise and light. We're safe in here." Nora joined him on the bench, sitting closer than she normally would, their wet shoulders almost touching. When the next lightning strike illuminated the barn, she jumped slightly, and without thinking, Ethan put his arm around her. "My mother was struck by lightning when I was a child," she admitted quietly. "She survived, but I've never forgotten how she looked afterwards, so still, her hair singed, her skin marked where the lightning exited her body. The doctor said it was a miracle she lived." "I didn't know," Ethan said, understanding her fear now. "It's not something I usually think about," Nora replied. "But in a storm this close—" She broke off as another lightning strike hit nearby, the thunder immediate and bone rattling. This time, she turned her face into Ethan's shoulder instinctively. He tightened his arm around her, offering what comfort he could. Her hair, dampened by the rain, carried the faint scent of lavender from the soap she made herself. She was trembling slightly, whether from fear or the chill of her wet clothes, he couldn't tell. "Tell me about Philadelphia," he said, trying to distract her. "What did you like best about living there?" Gradually, as she spoke of the city's parks and museums, the concerts she had attended before their fortunes turned, the small bookshop where the owner had allowed her to read without purchasing, her trembling subsided. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the barn, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that Ethan had been trying to ignore for weeks now. Having Nora in his arms, even in these innocent circumstances, awakened feelings he'd long suppressed. The fondness he felt for her had evolved into something deeper, something that both terrified and exhilarated him. She was his niece by marriage, his brother's daughter, a woman nearly a decade younger than himself. Any attachment beyond familial affection was inappropriate, impossible. Yet, as she relaxed against him, her head resting trustingly on his shoulder, Ethan couldn't deny the truth any longer. Somewhere along the way, he'd fallen in love with Nora. The realization hit him with the force of the lightning outside, leaving him momentarily breathless. "Uncle?" Nora's voice broke through his thoughts. "You've gone very quiet." Ethan cleared his throat, gently withdrawing his arm. "Just listening to the storm. I think it's moving past us now." Indeed, the thunder was growing more distant, the lightning less frequent. Rain still poured down, but the immediate danger seemed to have passed. They sat in silence for a few more minutes, the air between them charged with something Ethan wouldn't name. Finally, he stood. "We should make a run for the house while there's a break in the lightning." Nora rose as well, smoothing her damp skirts. "Thank you," she said softly, "for staying with me." "Of course," he replied, unable to meet her eyes. "That's what family does." The reminder of their relationship, of the boundaries that must exist between them, seemed to create a subtle shift in Nora's expression. Though it happened so quickly, Ethan wondered if he'd imagined it. Without further conversation, they dashed through the rain to the cabin, each lost in their own thoughts. That night, as Ethan lay awake listening to the rain drumming on the roof, he made a decision. The feelings he harbored for Nora could never be acted upon, but neither could he continue living in such close proximity while wrestling with them daily. It wasn't fair to either of them. Come morning, he would speak to her about her future, encourage her to consider Harding's obvious interest, or even to explore opportunities in Council Bluffs beyond the ranch. She deserved more than being trapped here with a man old enough to be her father, who couldn't offer her anything but complicated emotions and a life of isolation. But when morning came, bringing clear skies and air washed clean by the storm, Ethan found himself unable to broach the subject. Nora moved about the kitchen preparing breakfast, humming softly to herself, seemingly unaffected by the previous night's closeness. Perhaps, he thought with a mixture of relief and disappointment, the incident had meant nothing to her beyond the comfort offered during a frightening moment. Instead of the conversation he'd planned, Ethan announced he needed to ride out to check on the cattle after the storm. "Don't wait dinner for me," he added. "I'll likely be late." Nora looked at him curiously, as if sensing something behind his abrupt departure, but merely nodded. "Be careful. The creek might be high after all that rain." Ethan spent the day pushing himself physically, checking every inch of his property, helping a neighbor repair a section of fence downed by the storm, anything to exhaust himself enough that his mind wouldn't dwell on impossible feelings. It was nearly dark when he finally turned toward home, his body aching and his thoughts no clearer than they had been that morning. As he approached the ranch, he saw an unexpected sight: Dr. Harding's buggy outside the gate. A flicker of jealousy, sharp and unwelcome, shot through him before he ruthlessly suppressed it. This was good, he told himself. Harding was exactly the kind of man Nora should consider educated, established, genuinely good-hearted. Ethan slowed his horse, debating whether to delay his return further and give them privacy. But before he could decide, the cabin door opened and Harding emerged with Nora following. They stood talking on the porch for a moment, Harding's posture earnest, Nora's response too distant for Ethan to discern. Then, to his surprise, Harding mounted his buggy and departed without even the customary handshake that usually concluded his visits. By the time Ethan reached the gate, Harding's buggy was disappearing down the road toward town, and Nora had returned inside. Something about the scene left him uneasy. Had they argued? Had Harding finally declared himself, only to be rejected? Ethan found Nora in the kitchen, slicing bread for a late supper. "The doctor left in a hurry," he observed, attempting casualness. "Yes," Nora replied without looking up. "He had an emergency back in town." Something in her tone suggested there was more to the story, but Ethan didn't press. If Nora wanted to confide in him, she would do so in her own time. They ate a quiet meal, the silence between them different than their usual comfortable companionship, heavier, filled with unspoken thoughts. It was only as they were clearing the dishes that Nora finally spoke what was on her mind. "Dr. Harding asked me to marry him today." Ethan nearly dropped the plate he was drying. Despite having suspected Harding's intentions, hearing it confirmed sent a jolt through him. "I see," he managed, setting the plate down carefully. "That explains his hasty departure." "Yes," Nora said, her back to Ethan as she washed the last of the dishes. "I turned him down." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Ethan should have felt relieved, but instead, he felt a confusing mix of emotions: concern, guilt, and yes, a selfishness he wasn't proud of. "May I ask why?" he finally said. "Harding is a good man. He could give you a comfortable life, respect in the community." Nora turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Yes, he is a good man, and I do respect him greatly." She dried her hands slowly on a dish towel. "But I don't love him, and I believe marriage should be built on more than respect and comfort." "Love can grow from respect," Ethan found himself arguing, even as his heart rebelled against his own words. "Not all marriages begin with passion." "Did yours?" The question was soft, but direct. Ethan's breath caught at the unexpected query. "Yes," he admitted after a moment. "Sarah and I, it was immediate for both of us. But that doesn't mean it's the only way." Nora studied him, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for something specific. "Uncle Ethan, why are you trying to convince me to marry a man I don't love?" The question cut to the heart of his conflict. Why indeed? Because he wanted what was best for her, yes, but also because having her marry Harding would solve the problem of his own inappropriate feelings. It would create a clear boundary that could never be crossed. "I want you to have options," he said finally. "A future beyond this ranch. You're young, talented, with your whole life ahead of you. You deserve more than playing housekeeper to your reclusive uncle." A small smile touched Nora's lips. "Is that what you think I'm doing? Playing housekeeper?" "You know what I mean," Ethan said, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "You have gifts that shouldn't be wasted here." "I don't consider any of my time here wasted," Nora replied calmly. "I assist Dr. Harding regularly with his medical practice. I've made friends in town. I grow food that sustains us and others." She took a step closer to him. "And I've gotten to know the uncle my father always admired, but felt he'd lost. That alone would make the time worthwhile." Her proximity was making it difficult for Ethan to maintain his resolve. "Nora, there's something else you should know," she interrupted gently. "Something Dr. Harding told me today, before he proposed." Ethan braced himself, uncertain what revelation could possibly follow. "He discovered something while researching old county records for a patient's family history," Nora continued. "It seems my mother was married before, briefly, to a man who died in an accident just months after their wedding. She met my father a year later." She paused, letting the implication sink in. "Dr. Harding found the marriage certificate and death notice. My mother's first husband was named William Newell. My father was Jacob Miller." The information took a moment to process. "But your last name is Newell," Ethan said, confused. "Yes. My mother kept her first husband's name even after marrying father. It was somewhat scandalous, but she insisted. I never knew why until Dr. Harding showed me the records." Nora's eyes held his steadily. "It means James Miller was my father, but he wasn't your brother by blood." The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow. "That's impossible. James and I grew up together. We were brothers." "Half-brothers," Nora corrected gently. "According to the records, your father married James's mother after her first husband died. James was already 2 years old. Dr. Harding found your father's will, which refers to my son Ethan and my stepson James." Ethan sank into a chair, his mind reeling. Could it be true? There had always been physical differences between them, James fairer, Ethan darker like their father, but he'd never questioned their blood relationship. Yet something about the revelation resonated with half-forgotten memories, comments from townspeople when they were boys, the occasional tension between James and their father, particularly when discipline was involved. "Why would Dr. Harding research this?" he asked finally. Nora's cheeks colored slightly. "He noticed how similar our surnames are, Irwin and Newell. He thought perhaps there was a closer family connection than uncle and niece. When he discovered there wasn't, he felt it proper to inform me before proposing." "So we're not related by blood at all," Ethan said slowly, the implications of this washing over him. "Not even by marriage, since your father and I weren't blood brothers." "No," Nora confirmed quietly. "We're not related." The silence that followed was charged with everything they weren't saying. Ethan stared at her, his carefully constructed barriers crumbling. The feelings he'd been fighting, believing them inappropriate due to their family connection, suddenly stood in a new light. But that didn't mean they were reciprocated, or that acting on them would be wise. "This doesn't change anything," he said finally, rising from the chair. "You're still James's daughter. I still think of him as my brother, blood or not." "It changes everything," Nora contradicted softly. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her blue eyes. "It means I can tell you the real reason I refused Dr. Harding." Ethan held his breath, afraid to hope, afraid not to. "And what reason is that?" "That my heart is already given," she whispered, "to a stubborn rancher who built a fence to keep the world out, not realizing he'd left a gate open just wide enough for someone to slip through." Time seemed to stand still as her words registered. Ethan searched her face, looking for any sign of doubt or confusion, finding only clear certainty. "Nora," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I'm 10 years older than you. I've been broken by loss. I don't know if I can—" "You can," she interrupted, reaching up to touch his face. "You already have. Every day we've spent together, every story you've shared, every fence post you've repaired on this ranch, you've been rebuilding your heart alongside everything else." And then, with a courage that left him humbled, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his, a gentle questioning kiss that held both invitation and promise. For a moment, Ethan remained frozen, years of self-imposed isolation warring with the overwhelming desire to respond. Then, as if a dam had broken, he pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, pouring into it all the emotion he'd been suppressing for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I thought I could never love again," he admitted. "After Sarah, I built that fence to keep the pain out." "I know," Nora replied softly, "but fences can't keep out what's already inside you, the capacity to love, to connect. It was always there, waiting." "How did you know?" he asked, amazed at her perception. "When I wasn't even sure myself?" A smile played at her lips. "I recognized something in you that I understood the fear of loss, of opening yourself to possibility, but I also saw the man beneath it, kind, honorable, capable of such deep feeling." She brushed her fingers along his jaw. "How could I not fall in love with that man?" The simplicity of her declaration humbled him. For so long, he'd seen himself as damaged, incomplete, a man with too much past and too little future to offer anyone. Yet, here was this extraordinary woman, seeing him clearly and loving him, not despite his broken places, but because of how he'd begun to mend them. "I love you," he said, the words feeling both foreign and completely natural on his tongue. "I've been fighting it, telling myself it was wrong, impossible. And now?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "Now I'm wondering if we could rebuild something together, something stronger than what I tried to protect with that fence." Her smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "I think we already have," she said, taking his hand and leading him toward the door. "Come see." Confused but willing, Ethan followed her onto the porch and down the steps. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. Nora led him to the gate in his fence, the one he'd built so carefully, yet found himself leaving open more and more in recent weeks. "Look," she said simply, gesturing to the gate. In the moonlight, Ethan could see what he hadn't noticed before: small shoots of wild roses climbing up the gatepost, twining around the hinges, their first buds just beginning to form. Somehow, seeds had found purchase in the soil around his gate, taking root and growing despite neglect and drought. "Life finds a way," Nora said softly. "Even through the smallest openings we leave, sometimes without realizing it." Ethan touched the delicate shoots, marveling at their tenacity. Like his feelings for Nora, they had grown quietly, persistently, until they could no longer be ignored. "They'll bloom soon," he observed. "Yes," she agreed, "and so will we." In that moment, under the vast prairie sky, Ethan finally understood what Sarah had told him once, in the early days of their marriage. The heart is not a vessel with limited capacity, but a muscle that grows stronger with use. His love for Sarah would always be part of him, but it didn't prevent this new love from flourishing. Rather, having loved before had prepared him to recognize the miracle being offered now. He took Nora's hand, feeling as if he were stepping through his own gate, leaving behind the safety of isolation for the richer, riskier territory of connection. "I don't know what the future holds," he said honestly. "Neither do I," Nora replied, "but I'd rather face it together than apart." Ethan looked at the fence stretching around his property, seeing it now not as protection, but as limitation. "Tomorrow," he said decisively, "I'm taking it down." "All of it?" Nora asked, surprised. "Every last post," he confirmed. "We don't need it anymore." Her smile in the moonlight was worth every moment of fear he'd faced in opening his heart again. "In that case, Mr. Irwin, I believe we have plans for tomorrow. But tonight—" She squeezed his hand, her eyes reflecting starlight and promise. "Tonight," he agreed, drawing her close again. "We begin our story." And as their lips met beneath the endless Iowa sky, Ethan knew that the fence he'd built around his heart had served its purpose not to keep love out permanently, but to preserve what remained until he was ready to risk everything again. The gate he'd unknowingly left open had allowed Nora to walk through, bringing with her the courage he needed to dismantle the rest. 1 year later, the fence was indeed gone, replaced by a low stone wall with multiple openings that served more as decoration than barrier. The ranch had expanded, with a new wing added to the cabin, and the garden doubled in size. Ethan and Nora Irwin stood on their porch, watching the sunset, paint the prairie gold, much as it had the day she'd first arrived. "Any regrets?" Ethan asked, his arm around his wife's waist. "Not one," Nora replied, leaning into his embrace. Her free hand rested on her slightly rounded belly, where their first child grew a new beginning. Neither had expected when their paths crossed. Dr. Harding, who had graciously accepted Nora's rejection and remained their friend, had recently announced his engagement to a young widow from Omaha, ironically, a cousin of Edward Blackburn, who had not taken Nora's second rejection as gracefully, but had eventually moved on to pursue a banker's daughter in St. Louis. Life in Council Bluffs continued to evolve with the growing railroad presence. The town expanded, bringing new opportunities and challenges, but through it all, the ranch remained their sanctuary, no longer isolated by fences and pain, but open to the community they'd both come to value. Where the main gate had once stood, a rose-covered arch now welcomed visitors. The wild roses Nora had pointed out that night had flourished, joined by cultivated varieties she'd planted deliberately, creating a living reminder of how love had found its way through the barriers Ethan had constructed. "Your brother would be proud," Ethan said, thinking of James. Though not related by blood, their shared childhood and the daughter he'd raised made them brothers in every way that mattered. "Both our families would be," Nora agreed. "They'd see how their love lives on in us, in this place, in the child we're creating together." As darkness settled over the prairie, they remained on the porch, counting stars as they often did now, making plans and dreaming dreams that neither had dared imagine before finding each other. The fence was gone, but what it had protected Ethan's capacity to love deeply, completely, despite loss, remained, stronger than ever. And as Nora had predicted, they bloomed together, their roots intertwined, their hearts open to whatever the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that no fence could contain a love meant to flourish under the endless prairie sky.